is a pleasure, I believe, to welcome back to the program Erik Loomis. He is an associate professor of history at the University of Rhode Island, blogs at Lawyers, Guns, and Money, and author of his latest, A History of America in 10 Strikes. Erik, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me on.
All right, so you weave a story throughout of 10 strikes that tell the story of the U.S. Union movement, and there are two basic, I think, broad strokes about your book that it shows us. The first is that unions must, I guess, synthesize and engage in a struggle against racism and sexual equality, and without that engagement, they are doomed to fail. Which of those strikes, those 10 that you go through, exhibit that the most?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, if you look through American labor history, that one of the things that we really see, unfortunately, when we ask about why people often ask on the left, why does the working class vote against their interests? But and they mean that in terms of voting for, say, Republican politicians like Donald Trump, who are not going to help them. And yet you see large swaths of the white working class, as well as, white people generally, voting for Republican candidates. And the reason is that they are voting for their interests. They're voting for their white interests over their class interests. And so I think that in terms of thinking about, especially post 2016, what are the issues that we face? This is one of them, right? That the working class divides itself over race, and oftentimes when it succeeds, it does so by overcoming that. I mean, I think one great example of how it does overcome that is in the last chapter, where I talk about justice for janitors, where these incredible strikes in Los Angeles in the early 1990s that expand across the country of janitors, where the Service Employees International Union really creates a multiracial movement that unites workers of all races who are working as janitors, white, African American, and Latino, in using these really incredible, innovative actions that force these big building companies to agree to new janitorial contracts that vastly improve the conditions for these workers. And I think that that's a counterpoint to too often in the past, where you see, for instance, as I often point out, the first law that the United States Congress passes that really comes out of the labor movement, that's a major law in American history, is the Chinese Exclusion Act, which came out of the California labor movement by white workers who wanted to keep California white. And so I think that we see this over and over again, that the union movement is going to be successful in this country again. I think a critical component of that is that it fights for racial justice and doesn't allow a class to be divided by race.
It just brings to mind, we interviewed the author, I think his name was Robin Kelly, of Hammer and Hoe, which was about communists in Alabama in, I think it was in the 1920s. And the big roadblock to organizing just broadly unions at that time was race. And that's also, you write, explains why we have no unions in the South, more or less. I mean, just touch on that.
Yeah, it's still a critical issue today. I mean, 1946, the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which had organized the big factories of the North, they realized that the only way they're going to be able to survive long term is if they can organize the South, because they know that companies will close those northern plants and move to the South, which of course is exactly what happens. But the organizing effort fails on the issue of race, that in white communities in the South, white working class communities, unions get associated with civil rights. They get associated with being Jewish. They get associated with socialism. And this becomes a powerful tool that the elite classes are able to use to make white workers suspicious of a organization that will potentially attack their beloved white supremacy. And the Operation Dixie organizing attempts in the late 40s largely fail. Black workers are far more interested in organizing than white workers, but in order to try to counter this fear that unions equal equals civil rights, the CIO actually plays down its racial democracy, turning off those African American workers and still not attracting the white workers. And you see it again in 2014 in that effort to organize the Volkswagen plan in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where even though Volkswagen International actually wanted the union to get the German unions off their backs, the workers of that Chattanooga plant voted down the opportunity to organize with the United Auto Workers after a large-scale outside campaign by conservatives to taint the union as something that had ruined Detroit, using all of this racially charged imagery of a black Detroit to say this is what was going to happen to Chattanooga if they voted in the union, as if the UAW was responsible for the decline of Detroit, which is absolutely not true, but it's still very, very powerful in America today.
Well, all right. So what is in that regard, like, what is the answer there? I mean,
yeah, there's no easy answer. But the only potential way forward is for unions to be full-throated in favor of equality of all kinds, because especially given the demographic reality of the United States today, and who really makes up the working class of the United States? It's African Americans, it's Latinos, it's Asians, it's Native people, as well as working class whites. But in large parts of the country, working class whites are not a majority, and I think that fighting racism is a heck of a thing. I think that what you have to do is there's no evidence that trying to create a white working class strategy by playing down civil rights is going to be successful. There's plenty of evidence that it's not going to be successful. And I think what you have to do as a labor movement is give white workers reasons to counter that identity that they have in favor of white supremacy. It's not going to attract all of them. I mean, you're not going to get the entire white working class to suddenly come over and support racial democracy. But you only need a relatively small number of them to make that switch, to have a huge political change in America, as well as to organize a lot of factories and a lot of other workplaces. And so anybody who's saying there's an easy answer to this is full of it, because there's not. But there's really no other choice other than to fight for racial democracy, because racial democracy and workplace democracy are really, in many ways, the same thing in a nation that is moving away from being majority white.
Right. And I guess, obviously, racism's fairly durable. It seems to have lasted quite a while. But I guess the bottom line is you simply can't run from those issues, because it's a fool's errand is basically that's the starting point.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it just wouldn't work. I mean, fundamentally, it wouldn't work. You turn off the reality of who the working class actually is in the United States today, which is primarily people of color, while not actually attracting too many members of the white working class. If they already believe that union equals racial democracy and they're never going to support that, then you're not going to really appeal to them. But I think that if unions do work hard, and we as everyday citizens demand widespread economic justice in this nation, as well as widespread racial justice, that you are going to have a good potential of creating a movement that is going to attract some of these people. I mean, we have to remember there were many, white working class people who voted for Donald Trump, but then who also voted for Barack Obama. They're not lost to us forever. And I think that this is part of a broader, I think, discussion about what kind of agenda can the left create that provides enough incentive for white people to turn away from racism in order to realize that maybe they do believe in white supremacy on some form or another, but they also believe in a bigger paycheck, and they actually believe that these institutions, whether it's unions or the Democratic Party or whatever, are going to actually provide that for them.